I was mid-bite into a bacon sandwich when I saw a man in work boots unloading his suitcase onto my porch like he just arrived at a summer rental. I didn't recognize him, which was already strange considering my nearest neighbor is 7 miles away. I stepped out, coffee in hand, ready to ask if he was lost. Instead, he glanced up, smiled like we were old friends, and said, "Hey, your sister told me I could take the upstairs room." Problem was, I don't have a sister. Turned out, my sister was in fact Karen McNulty, the HOA president from the tiny resort town 30 minutes down the mountain. I've known her for years, not in a friendly way, because she's been lobbying to fold my land into her HOA's jurisdiction ever since she discovered my lodge on a winter hike. Apparently, she decided to skip the annexation paperwork this time and just give the place away. I asked the guy, who eventually introduced himself as Dave, how exactly this was arranged. He explained, without an ounce of hesitation, that Karen had promised him exclusive lodge rights for the next 6 months while he got back on his feet. She'd even printed up some kind of fake-looking temporary occupancy certificate with my property's address on it. I told him this wasn't happening, but he wasn't belligerent about it. He seemed confused, almost embarrassed, and I could tell Karen had sold him some sob story. He offered to call her so she can explain, which, of course, I said yes to because I wanted to hear this circus directly from the ringleader. She answered on the second ring with that sugary voice she uses when she thinks she's already won. "Oh, so you've met my brother? I knew you'd hit it off," she said. I told her point-blank that Dave needed to pack his things and leave. Her tone snapped from cordial to cutting in about 3 seconds. She claimed I was jeopardizing the HOA's community outreach program, and that Dave was a valued member deserving of stable housing. I asked her when exactly my private mountain lodge became an HOA outreach facility. She ignored the question and started rattling off some nonsense about a recent vote and the board's authority to reassign underutilized properties. I reminded her I am not in her HOA, and my property isn't underutilized just because she's never been invited inside. She told me to check my mailbox and hung up. That's when I knew she was up to something. The next morning, I drove into town, opened my P.O. box, and found an envelope with the HOA's crest embossed like they were running a royal court. Inside was a letter stating that, effective immediately, the HOA had assumed temporary stewardship of my lodge to better serve the needs of the community. It was signed by Karen and 2 other board members I'd never met. The letter also claimed that I had failed to respond to a notice sent 2 weeks prior, a notice I never received. Dave, to his credit, didn't want to push his luck after hearing all this. He offered to leave if I'd give him a ride down to the bus stop. I did, and as we drove, he admitted Karen had told him I was some kind of absentee investor who only visited once a year and wouldn't even notice. He apologized for the trouble, and I actually believed him. Dave wasn't the problem. Back at the lodge, I did a thorough check. No damage, no stolen items, but I found a stack of HOA flyers stuffed under my front doormat. They advertised an open house at my lodge next Saturday. That's right, Karen had scheduled an event here without my knowledge, and judging by the way she operates, she probably planned to have me look like the rude recluse who refused to welcome the community. I decided not to call her or send a warning. Let her think her little open house was going ahead as planned. If she wanted to play at being in charge of my land, she was about to get a lesson in what property boundaries really meant. Over the next 3 days, I rented a small excavator from a buddy who owed me a favor. While Karen was busy setting up whatever refreshments and ribbon-cutting speeches she had in mind, I was digging, literally, around the entire HOA headquarters. The building sat on a plot right at the end of their manicured cul-de-sac, with a single driveway in and out. It wasn't much effort to carve a 2-foot-wide trench along the perimeter, making it impossible for any car to enter or leave without bridging it. I timed it so the trench would be finished the morning of the open house. By 9 a.m., Karen was calling me, not because of the trench, but because the event was a disaster. People had shown up to my lodge and found a locked gate and me sitting on the porch with my coffee, telling them they'd been scammed. Most of them weren't even mad at me. They were mad at her for misleading them. By noon, the trench news broke. A delivery truck tried to access the HOA office and got stuck halfway over the gap, blocking the street. Karen stormed up my driveway at 1 p.m., red-faced and shaking, demanding I fill in that ridiculous moat. I told her the trench was on my land. She tried to argue it was interfering with HOA operations, and I asked her where in her bylaws it said she could commandeer my property but I couldn't dig on mine. She left in a huff, swearing she'd have the county on my back by tomorrow. What she didn't know was that I'd already filed a formal trespass and harassment complaint against her that morning. And that was just the opening round. She thought she'd made a power move by handing my lodge to her brother, but all she'd really done was open the door for me to dismantle her precious HOA from the ground up, starting with that trench. The real fun was about to begin. By the next morning, the trench had taken on a life of its own. The HOA board members were furious, not because of the inconvenience, but because they couldn't get into their own building without walking across a couple of makeshift plywood bridges the maintenance guy had thrown down. I drove past slowly that morning, purely for reconnaissance, but also to enjoy the sight of Karen balancing on a plank in her heels while clutching a coffee like it was her lifeline. She spotted my truck and immediately marched toward me. I rolled down the window just far enough to talk without giving her the satisfaction of full eye contact. She accused me of sabotaging community infrastructure and obstructing municipal access, which was an impressive feat of nonsense considering her headquarters was neither municipal nor mine to obstruct, it was theirs. I told her the trench was on my private property, and if she wanted to prove otherwise, she should hire a surveyor. Her eyes narrowed. She knew exactly what that meant. I had checked the land maps, and I knew the HOA lot line was 5 feet shy of their fence on every side. That 5-foot strip belonged to me. The truth is, years ago, when the HOA's founding developer plotted the land, he misread the surveyor's report and left that 5-foot buffer between their property and the surrounding parcels. I bought my land long after, and though I never needed to use that sliver of dirt for anything, it now served as a perfect legal chokehold. Without permission to cross it, they couldn't technically enter their own lot by vehicle. Karen's next move was as bold as it was stupid. That afternoon, she showed up at the lodge with 2 sheriff's deputies, smiling like a cat who'd already eaten the canary. She accused me of criminal vandalism and restricting access to public resources. I handed one of the deputies a folder with my deed, the survey map, and photos of the trench, all neatly time-stamped. The deputy took one look at the paperwork, then at Karen, and asked her flatly, "Ma'am, are you aware this strip of land is his?" She froze for a half-second, then tried to pivot. "That may be true," she said, "but the HOA has an easement for ingress and egress." Unfortunately for her, that was a lie. I told the deputy I'd checked the county registry myself. No easement had ever been recorded. The deputy told Karen this was a civil matter, and not something they could enforce. Her smile cracked. The deputies left. For a couple of days, it was blissfully quiet. I figured she was regrouping, maybe trying to convince the other board members to bankroll a lawsuit. But then I got a letter from the county's zoning office, claiming I was in violation of unapproved earthworks and drainage obstruction. The kicker? The complaint had been filed anonymously. I called the zoning officer, who, to his credit, wasn't out to make my life harder. He told me off the record that the complaint was unusually detailed, complete with photos and a GPS pin of the trench. "It's obviously someone with a grudge," he said. I asked if there was a way to resolve it without tearing the trench out. He suggested I submit an agricultural improvement exemption. If I could argue the trench was part of a water diversion plan for fire safety, it might be approved. That night, I stayed up drafting the exemption request. I included a plan for seasonal runoff control, wildfire mitigation, and a note about how the trench would protect my property from erosion, true enough, if not the real reason it existed. I sent it in, knowing it would buy me time. While I was busy covering my legal bases, Karen was plotting her counterattack. She couldn't get her events hosted at my lodge anymore, so she decided to move the war to the court of public opinion. She put out a community bulletin, accusing me of isolating the HOA from essential resources and undermining neighborhood unity. It read like a hostage note written in polite suburban font. At first, I thought no one would care, until I drove into town and got side-eyed by the barista at the coffee shop, the hardware store clerk, even the postmaster. Clearly, Karen's reach went beyond the HOA's dues-paying members. That's when I realized I needed to change tactics. If Karen was going to make this public, I'd fight back publicly, but smarter. I printed up my own flyers titled, "Did you know? Your HOA doesn't own the land around its office." Inside, I laid out the 5-foot strip detail, the fake occupancy certificate she'd given her so-called brother, and the open house scam. I made sure every statement was backed by photos or documents, so she couldn't call it slander. I distributed the flyers discreetly, slipping them into mailboxes outside of HOA jurisdiction, leaving stacks at the general store, and posting them on the bulletin board at the diner where all the off-duty firefighters eat breakfast. By the following weekend, the narrative had shifted. People weren't whispering about me, they were whispering about her. Karen's response was pure Karen. She called an emergency meeting of the HOA, inviting members and concerned residents. The meeting was open to the public, so I went. I sat in the back, arms folded, listening as she tried to spin everything. She painted herself as a victim of my uncooperative nature, and claimed I had created an unsafe situation with the trench. When she asked if there were any questions from the floor, I stood up. I asked, loudly enough for the dozen non-members in attendance to hear, whether she'd like me to bring the temporary occupancy certificate she forged into the next meeting for everyone to examine. You could have heard a pin drop. She stammered something about miscommunication and good faith. But the damage was done. After the meeting, one of the other board members, a guy named Mitch, pulled me aside. He wasn't a fan of mine, but he clearly wasn't on board with Karen's more reckless schemes either. He hinted that she'd been using HOA funds for community projects that had no actual budget approval. I told him I wasn't interested in HOA politics, but if something illegal was happening, I'd want to know before it spilled over onto my land. The next morning, Mitch called me. He'd found something, a series of invoices for event coordination and property enhancement, that all traced back to a company owned by Karen's cousin. The kicker? One of those property enhancements was the so-called outreach program at my lodge. She'd billed the HOA nearly $5,000 for preparing and staging the property for long-term guest occupancy. I asked Mitch to send me copies. When they arrived, I knew exactly what I'd do. I packaged the invoices, the occupancy certificate, and the flyer evidence into one neat, ugly little dossier. I wasn't taking it to the HOA. I was taking it to every single homeowner in that community, directly. Karen thought she was fighting for control over my lodge. She didn't realize she'd just given me everything I needed to undermine her control over her own empire. And I was only getting started. I waited until the following Saturday morning to drop the dossier. Timing was everything. Saturday was the HOA's community coffee hour, when half the neighborhood gathered in the clubhouse to gossip and pretend they liked each other's landscaping choices. I parked my truck just outside the cul-de-sac and started walking door to door, knocking and handing out thick envelopes. I didn't say much, just, "You'll want to read this before next week's dues meeting." By the time I got to the last house, I could already hear the rumble. Someone must have opened theirs right away because voices were carrying across manicured lawns. I heard a man exclaim, "She charged us what for that lodge?" followed by a woman muttering, "I told you something was off." I didn't stick around. The goal wasn't to watch the explosion, just to light the fuse. The real reaction hit that evening when my phone rang. It was Mitch, speaking in a low voice like we were in a spy movie. "You broke the board," he said. "Half of them want her out, The other half think you're out to destroy the HOA. I told him I wasn't out to destroy it. I just wanted Karen to understand she couldn't touch my property. He chuckled and said, "Well, she's not taking it that way. She's already talking about suing you for defamation." That night, I checked my email and found a message from a law firm in the city, accusing me of maliciously disseminating false and damaging materials about their client, Karen McNulty. They demanded I retract my statements and destroy all printed and digital copies of my dossier. The tone was aggressive, but the demand was laughable. Everything in that packet was verifiable fact. I replied with a short message. "Happy to meet you in court. Bring your client's cousin's business ledgers." The next morning, things escalated again. I woke up to the sound of machinery, not on my property, but close. I walked down the driveway and saw a rented skid steer carving a dirt path around the back of the HOA headquarters lot, bypassing my trench entirely. Karen stood there, sunglasses on, directing the operator like she was building the Panama Canal. She saw me watching and smirked. It was bold, I'll give her that. She'd found a way to avoid crossing my 5-foot strip, barely. The path curved behind their building, hugging the neighboring property line so tightly that it was technically on someone else's land. I knew whose, old man Ridley's. He owned a neglected half-acre behind the HOA building, and last I heard, he hadn't been up here in years. I also knew that land was zoned as private woodland, not for commercial access. I waited until Karen left, then called Ridley. He picked up after the third ring, voice groggy. I explained the situation, and there was a long pause before he said, "They're on my land?" I told him they were, and he let out a slow, amused laugh. "Let 'em dig. I'll call the county tomorrow. They'll get a fine so big they'll wish they'd paid me rent." Sure enough, 2 days later, the skid steer was gone, and a bright orange, "Stop work" notice was taped to the HOA's back door. Word spread fast that they were under investigation for unpermitted land use. Karen must have been seething, because that afternoon she rolled into my driveway again, this time without deputies, without pretense. She just wanted to yell. She accused me of harassing her, of turning the community against her, of engineering the county's action. I told her calmly that all I'd done was make a phone call to a man whose property she'd invaded. Her voice rose until she was practically shaking. "You think you've won, but you don't understand who you're dealing with," she said. I told her she was right, I didn't. Because all I'd seen so far was someone willing to burn down their own reputation for the sake of petty control. Her eyes flickered for a second, like she realized she'd given me more than she meant to. Then she turned on her heel and drove off. I didn't see her for a week, but the fallout kept coming. Mitch called again to tell me the board had forced a vote of no confidence. Karen survived, barely, but her authority was weakened. She'd had to promise to rebuild trust and focus on positive community engagement. That sounded like PR fluff, but I knew Karen well enough to guess it meant she was plotting something bigger to reassert control. Sure enough, the something bigger arrived the following Friday. A certified letter from the county announced that my property was now subject to review for potential inclusion in the HOA's jurisdiction. I didn't even think that was possible without my consent, but Karen had apparently filed a petition citing regional safety and emergency access concerns. She'd framed it as a public safety matter, arguing that my land was strategically positioned for wildfire evacuation routes and therefore critical to coordinated community response. It was clever, manipulative, but clever. If she could get the county to agree, she'd have leverage to impose HOA rules on me whether I wanted them or not. I spent that night reading every zoning code and annexation guideline I could find. Buried in the legalese, I found one line that gave me hope. Any annexation proposal had to undergo a public hearing, and property owners could block it by presenting a demonstrated pattern of incompatible land use or community harm caused by the annexing body. If I could prove Karen's HOA had acted recklessly or illegally, say, by trespassing, forging documents, or misappropriating funds, then I could kill the petition outright. The problem was, I needed more than the evidence I'd already shared. I needed something that made the county's legal department wince hard enough to toss the petition in the trash. Mitch was my best shot. I called him and told him what was happening. He hesitated, then said, "If I send you what I've got, you didn't get it from me." The next morning, an unmarked envelope showed up in my mailbox. Inside were internal HOA emails, real gems. One was from Karen to the board saying, "If we can't get him to cooperate voluntarily, we'll just have to fold his property into the association by necessity. Once it's under our covenants, he'll either follow the rules or get fined until he moves." Another was a spreadsheet of anticipated revenues that included projected fines from my property for non-compliant exterior aesthetics and unapproved agricultural structures. It was exactly what I needed, written proof that her safety argument was a pretext for a cash grab. I spent the weekend compiling it into a clean, easy-to-read packet, with timelines, source citations, and side-by-side comparisons to the county's own annexation guidelines. When the hearing notice came in the mail the following Tuesday, I was ready. I didn't just plan to defend my property. I planned to make Karen's entire operation look like a liability the county wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. What I didn't know yet was that Karen wasn't coming to the hearing alone, and the person she was bringing with her had the power to blow my entire strategy out of the water. The hearing was set for a Wednesday morning in the county's drafty old courthouse, the kind of place where the chairs creak louder than most of the speakers. I arrived early with my packet under my arm, ready to slide it into the record before Karen could open her mouth. The room was half empty when I walked in, but my stomach tightened when I saw who she was sitting with. At her side was a tall man in a pressed suit, hair slicked back, wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Karen leaned toward him, whispering like they were plotting a heist. I recognized him immediately, Councilman Robert Vale, chair of the county zoning committee. The guy who would ultimately decide whether my land could be annexed. I'd met him once before at a fundraiser for the volunteer fire department. He'd struck me as the kind of man who remembered people only if they could cut him a check. Seeing him here with Karen was like watching the ref arrive in the other team's jersey. When the hearing began, Karen went first. She launched into her public safety speech, hitting all the emotional notes: wildfire risks, evacuation bottlenecks, community unity in times of crisis. She even threw in a story about an elderly HOA member who couldn't reach medical aid because my road wasn't maintained to their standards. I knew that was a lie. My road connected directly to the main highway, but it sounded just believable enough to sway people who didn't know the terrain. Councilman Vale nodded along, asking her gentle follow-up questions that let her double down on her narrative. It was obvious they'd rehearsed. Then it was my turn. I started calmly, handing out my packet to the clerk so it could be entered into the record. I outlined the real history between Karen and me, the forged occupancy certificate, the unauthorized use of my lodge for an open house, the trench incident, the backdoor land grab attempt through Ridley's property. I walked them through the HOA's own emails, showing exactly how they planned to profit off my forced inclusion. I kept my voice even, no grandstanding, no shouting, just fact after fact. My goal was to make it impossible for anyone to see this as a good-faith safety effort. By the time I finished, a couple of the other council members were looking at Karen like they just smelled sour milk. That's when Vale leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Mr. Ross," he said, "I appreciate your presentation, but I have to point out, these documents you've submitted, they're internal HOA communications. How did you obtain them?" It was a loaded question. If I admitted they came from Mitch, I'd put him in Karen's crosshairs. If I refused to answer, they could imply my evidence was illegitimate. I told him the truth without giving him the hook. They were provided to me by a member of the HOA board who was concerned about misconduct. That person requested confidentiality, and I intend to honor it. Vale's smile tightened. "Well, without verification, we can't necessarily accept these as credible." One of the other council members, A woman named Alvarez cut him off. We absolutely can if they appear authentic and haven't been disputed. She turned to Karen. Are you denying these emails are yours? Karen's mouth opened and closed twice before she settled on. Those are being taken out of context. Which, in a room like this, is the closest thing to an admission you can give without actually saying yes. I could see Vale didn't like that the tide was shifting. He tried to steer the discussion back to regional safety planning, but Alvarez wasn't having it. She requested a formal review of the HOA's financial records before any annexation could be considered. That was a win for me. It meant delay, and in politics, delay can be death for a bad idea. But Karen wasn't done. She stood, flipping through her own papers, and pulled out something I hadn't expected, a letter from the county fire chief. It stated that my property was a potential hazard in need of integrated community oversight because of unpermitted structures and improper fuel management. My heart sank. I'd been careful to keep my land compliant, but I knew exactly what she was talking about. Last year, I built a small tool shed and a woodshed without bothering with permits, figuring no one would care this far up the mountain. Apparently someone did. The fire chief wasn't at the hearing, so I couldn't challenge him directly. Vale seized on it immediately, suggesting the annexation could help bring the property up to code for everyone's safety. Karen glanced at me like she just landed a perfect punch. I needed to shift the focus fast. I reminded the council that the HOA had repeatedly trespassed on private property, staged unauthorized events, and falsified documents, all of which posed far greater risks to community trust and safety than a couple of sheds. I offered to have my land inspected by the county fire marshal within 30 days and to remedy any actual hazards myself, without HOA involvement. That offer seemed to land well with Alvarez and 2 other members. Vale called for a recess. During the break, I stepped outside to get some air, and that's when Mitch appeared from the crowd. He handed me a folded sheet of paper and whispered, "You're going to want this if they push the safety angle." I opened it and saw a copy of an HOA maintenance log, specifically, one showing that they'd let 2 of their own community fire hydrants go without testing for over 3 years. When the hearing resumed, I waited until Vale tried again to hammer the safety point. Then I dropped the log into the record. If this council is going to consider annexation for safety reasons, I said, perhaps it should also consider whether the HOA is capable of meeting its own safety obligations. It was the knockout punch I'd hoped for. Alvarez's eyebrows shot up. Another member actually laughed under his breath. Karen shifted in her seat, but for once, she didn't speak. Vale wrapped things up quickly after that, announcing that the annexation petition would be deferred until the HOA could address serious operational concerns, which was bureaucratic speak for "this isn't happening anytime soon." Outside the courthouse, Karen walked past me without a word, her heels clicking like gunshots on the stone steps. She wasn't smiling anymore. I thought maybe, just maybe, this would be the end of it. It wasn't. That night, I got a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of my trench, taken from the road, with a message underneath. "Enjoy your little victory. It won't last." For the first time since this started, I wondered if Karen was willing to take things beyond legal games and into something uglier. If she was, then the trench, the flyers, the hearing, those were all just opening moves. And she was about to make the next one. The text rattled around in my head all night. I didn't sleep much, partly because I was replaying the day's hearing, partly because I was wondering what "it won't last" meant coming from someone like Karen. She'd already tried legal routes, public opinion, and backdoor deals. If she was sending cryptic threats now, that meant we were heading into territory where the gloves were coming off. By sunrise, I decided on a simple rule. I wouldn't wait for her next move. I'd force it. The longer I let her set the pace, the more ground she could chip away from me. So, after my second cup of coffee, I started calling in favors. First was Ridley, the guy whose property she'd illegally used to skirt my trench. I asked if I could rent a corner of his lot for a storage project. He laughed and said, "For Karen-related mischief? Free of charge." Next, I called my buddy Tanner, who ran a construction supply yard. By noon, a flatbed truck was unloading 12 massive shipping containers onto that corner of Ridley's property, stacked in a half-circle like a fortress wall. They blocked any conceivable path from the HOA headquarters to the back road. Even if Karen wanted to reroute again, she'd need a crane. I didn't hide it either. I parked my lawn chair right on the ridge and watched as HOA board members gathered to gawk. Some took pictures. Others argued in low voices. Karen didn't show her face that day, but I knew she'd heard. 2 days later, she made her move. I came home from a supply run to find a county truck parked in my driveway. A code enforcement officer was walking around my lodge, clipboard in hand. I stepped out and asked what was going on. He explained that he'd received multiple complaints about unsafe structures and uncontrolled vegetation on my property. Sounded like Karen had pulled the fire hazard card again. But I was ready. I handed him a copy of the inspection request I'd filed right after the hearing. "Already in the works," I told him. He seemed almost relieved, probably because it meant less paperwork for him. He glanced at my woodshed and tool shed, measured a few distances, and said, "If this is the worst of it, you'll be fine once you slap a permit on these." As he left, he leaned in and muttered, "Off the record? This isn't the first time I've been sent up here over nothing." That told me two things. Karen had been using county departments as her personal errand service, and people were starting to notice. That night, Mitch called. His voice was low, urgent. "She's not going to let this die. There's talk she's trying to get the board to approve emergency measures to recover what she calls community assets under duress." "That's your lodge, man." "How exactly?" I asked. "Something about a temporary receivership. If she convinces enough members it's the only way to protect community resources, she could get a vote to seize use of the property until the annexation's resolved. It's crazy, but the bylaws are vague enough she might twist them. If she pulled that off, I'd be stuck in court for months trying to reverse it, and by then, she could have turned my lodge into her personal events hall. I needed a play that would make any attempt at receivership so toxic, no board member would touch it. That's when I remembered the hydrant log Mitch had given me. If the board's negligence could be tied to real, provable risk, it would undercut any safety narrative Karen tried to spin. But I wanted more than negligence. I wanted outright dereliction. The next morning, I drove to the county fire department archives. It took hours of sifting through maintenance records, but by late afternoon, I found what I was looking for. A formal notice from 3 years ago warning the HOA that 2 hydrants failed pressure testing. The follow-up section was blank. No record of repairs, no retests, nothing. They'd ignored it entirely. Armed with that, I drafted an open letter, not to the HOA, but to the entire community and the local newspaper. I laid out the hydrant failures, the ignored repair notices, the potential liability in the event of a fire. I didn't mention my trench, the annexation, or even Karen by name. I didn't need to. Everyone knew who ran the HOA. The paper ran it in their Sunday edition under the headline, "Fire Safety Concerns at Lakeshore HOA." By Monday morning, it was all anyone in town was talking about. The county fire chief publicly announced a surprise inspection of all HOA-owned hydrants. Karen couldn't spin that as my fault without admitting the problem existed. 2 days later, Mitch called laughing so hard he could barely speak. "She called an emergency board meeting to address the hydrant thing. Half the members refused to show up. The ones who did are demanding she step down as president. She's bleeding out politically." But Karen wasn't done yet. That evening my motion lights went off. I looked out and saw two figures in hoodies standing near the trench, measuring it with what looked like a survey wheel. I stepped onto the porch with my flashlight, and they bolted, straight toward the HOA building. I didn't chase them. I didn't need to. I'd already installed trail cams along the trench line. The footage showed exactly what I suspected: two HOA members, both on the board, taking measurements and snapping photos. I sent the clips to the county sheriff with a note asking whether unauthorized surveying of private property counted as trespassing. He replied the next morning, "It does. We'll handle it." That was the break I didn't know I needed. Within a week, both men had resigned from the board to avoid charges. Karen lost two of her most loyal allies. And with the hydrant scandal still fresh, no one wanted to fill their seats. The board was running on fumes. The receivership vote never happened. The annexation petition was quietly withdrawn, pending further review. And Karen? She disappeared from public view for nearly a month. No calls, no letters, no surprise visits. I thought maybe she'd finally gotten the message. Then, one crisp October morning, I found a package on my porch. No return address, no markings. Inside was a single item, a miniature plastic backhoe, the kind you'd find in a kid's sandbox. Taped to it was a note in block letters. "See you in spring." I laughed out loud, but there was a flicker of unease under it. She wasn't done. She was just waiting. Fine. So was I.